is key. So I know it's important to you all as well as to us to make sure that we're able to facilitate that transfer of vehicle ownership in a timely way, an efficient way. Our customers want that as well. They certainly expect that when they think about the way they do transactions for other things. And so doing e-titling is one way to enable that. Also, as we think about title and liens, I know that's a conversation we've had a lot, especially with our Dealers Association. How do we make sure liens are put on efficiently and released efficiently so we can make sure that title continues to move as transactions occur? Reducing the likelihood of fraud and counterfeit titles. I mentioned those security features on the paper title, but the reality is we have a whole set of investigators who work very hard at MVA, often through tips from our branch offices or dealers or tag-in titles, that catch fraudulent titles that unfortunately have been accepted. And so there are some additional verifications that we can put on the process when it's electronic to ensure that both individuals are who they are presenting themselves to be. Also, we know that that paper, that title paper, those security features is very expensive. So if we can do it in a better way, that obviously allows us to save costs as well, which is always a good thing. And so this flowchart has been borrowed from the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. And while there's a lot going on in the chart and not certainly something we're asking you to become experts in, I think what they were trying to show with this is how many partners, frankly, we have involved in our vehicle transactions. If you think about it, and you can see the various numbers, starting with that dealer trade or reassignment. Second is titling and registering a new vehicle. Then you have the used vehicle flavor. Down to the bottom, you've got managing the liens and the financial institutions who are involved there. Managing the vehicle record and all those different agencies that are involved in that process. And number 5. Number 6 being that in-state title transfer, and 7 being out-of-state. And then you can see that vehicle owner, number 8. And off the dealer trade assignment, you used to have those vehicle manufacturers and floor planners as well as auction houses. So these are all people who are part of the process today. And so as we think about how do we go from a paper process to electronic process, it's really important that we consider all of our partners, all the people that have a piece of this effort, and ensure that in making this process hopefully more secure and more efficient, that it works for all these various partners. That being said, we also know that we can't do it all at once, that this is going to be a phased-in process where we're going to look at different components along the way and how we can build different pieces of it. Just as we've modernized and built pieces of our system over time, this will be a process where you'll see initial solutions, and some of which we'll demonstrate today, but then more long-term solutions. This chart is something, again, developed by AMVA to help jurisdictions understand where they are in electronic titling progress. Essentially, it breaks down, and I think this is really helpful because, again, trying to think about what is an e-title. There's so many components to it, it's just not one thing, as we all know. And so this breaks down the different things that, frankly, we're doing a lot of today already, from electronic lien to electronic registration and title, participating in MVA in order to verify with other jurisdictions, title records, having vehicle management systems, a customer portal, and that'll be important as we walk through the actual transaction later, because when it's a private sale, the customer will be using that customer portal. Customer identity management, referenced that a few times, the customer really validating that they are who they are presenting themselves to be. Of course, dealer titling, which we already do today, intrastate e-title transfers, and then interstate. So I think this chart is important, that it's just not flipping on the switch as we saw on the prior chart. It really is a building block, and each piece of it is a component of moving us forward in developing this full electronic record that will then enable us to be able to turn that title piece of paper into a title record. I'm now going to turn it over to Nikki, who's going to walk through the first piece of this that we've been working on in terms of private sales and e-titles.
Thank you. So when we started looking at e-titling and started to think about what is the logical place for us to start, we started with a simple transaction. None of these are simple transactions, but we took it down to the basic, a private sale between one buyer and one seller. There's an asterisk that I'm going to get to in a couple slides. The vehicle has no liens, no brands. It isn't leased now or on the transfer, and it has a valid inspection on file. So this is what we have defined as our happy path. We have taken it, started with this, and then as we move forward, we'll be adding in and expanding the happy path so that we bring more and more vehicles into being eligible for this process. So how will it work? So the first part, the intrastate, would be the buyer and the seller are both in Maryland. Chrissy mentioned that our customer portal plays a key role in this, and this is exactly how these transactions are facilitated. So that the buyer and the seller have a MyMVA account. The seller is going to initiate that transfer of the vehicle. They're going to pick the vehicle that they want to transfer. They're going to generate a token, give it to the buyer. Then the seller is going to provide the buyer with that token outside of the MyMVA account. The buyer logs in, reviews the vehicle details, accepts the transfer of that record, and then proceeds with titling and registering the vehicle. Where the buyer and the seller are in different states, and we are currently working with a proof of concept with MVA to build out a e-titling solution between a buyer and a seller in different states. And the states in that solution now are Maryland, Arizona, and West Virginia, with other states joining. So in this case, the buyer and the seller are in different states. The buyer and the seller must have an account with their MVA or DMV, and the seller initiates the transfer, and like the intrastate, gives the buyer a token. The buyer is going to review those details, accepts the transfer. In this MVA model, as designed now, the seller goes back in, releases that vehicle record, and then the buyer is able to proceed with titling and registering that vehicle. And so we started development on our interstate solution with our partners from Arizona and West Virginia. And so just thought it might be helpful to show a few slides as to what that looks like. So again, this is the seller logging into their, let's say the seller's in Maryland, they would be logging into their MyMVA account. It lays out which vehicles are eligible. So again, this is a narrow group of vehicles to start with, and then we will expand. The seller is picking the vehicle that they want to transfer to the seller and confirming that they want to proceed. This is where the token is generated, and this is the secure way of the buyer. The seller is going to provide this token to the seller, and so this gets to the authentication and identity verification that Chrissy mentioned. And so this token is provided, the seller provides the token to the buyer, and there are time limits associated with this. These time limits are set by the MVA committee that we've initially decided on how long this token will last. And so then now the seller's provided the buyer with the token, and now the buyer is logging into their state's customer portal. They have to enter the token to be able to access the information. And then the vehicle details that we saw on the last screen are populated here for the buyer to see those details. So they are confirming that, yes, this is in fact the vehicle that I think I'm buying, all right, that the seller and I talked about. Here's the information, and then the buyer has the option to accept or reject this offer. And again, in the MVA model, it goes back to, the transaction goes back to the seller for the seller to release the ownership of the vehicle. Again, the same vehicle information is displayed to the seller, and then the seller is confirming that, yep, I want to release ownership of this vehicle to the buyer. As you can see, there's almost at every screen, there's an option to cancel. If something, for the buyers, if it came through with a different mileage or something that the buyer wasn't aware of, the buyer has the option to cancel, and then the seller has that at this point as well. And then the next step of the process would be that the buyer would then title the vehicle using their state online portal, and then if the buyer wanted to register the vehicle, the buyer could proceed down that path as well as registering the vehicle. So our timeline for the two processes, so the interstate process where both parties are in Maryland, that we are on target to implement later this year in the fall sometime. The interstate process where the buyer and the sellers are in different states. And I mentioned the asterisk earlier, MVA is exploring and is likely to allow for more than one seller to be in the pilot for the MVA process. And we are looking to test with the other states in the fall of this year. So the intrastate plan will be available sooner than the interstate, but both are progressing nicely. So Chrissy, you wanted to do what's next?
Yeah, so I'm sure you're thinking great private sale model, but what's the next step for dealers? And so we wanted to let you know we are focused on how we can continue to move forward there. So MVA is working on a best practice that is going to focus on how to handle that situation for dealers, both new and used vehicles. What does that look like? Obviously, if there was a common standard or best practice for us all to do, that would be better so that we would be able to be consistent again as we think about especially other jurisdictions in close proximity to us. And then I know there's been questions about the use of ERT systems for e-titling. Again, hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a better sense of the fact that electronic titling is titling, but done electronically, and there's an electronic record. And so many of the systems we're already using today will be part of the process that we will use moving forward as we consider what that e-title looks like, and there'll be opportunities for participation in that as we evolve. And then in terms of controlled documents, we are and have been talking to the dealers associations about that and how do we move forward on documents that currently today are in paper format because they've got that inventory control number. So more to come there, but we are considering how we can work collaboratively with the industry to make that happen. And then the other component that we thought was important to just put on your radar is the use of the mobile driver's license. I mentioned that earlier as part of that verified credential. And so part of the standard for e-titling, we have to make sure that we know who that customer is, and Nikki walked through what that looks like. But having that MDL that has that higher level of verification gives us that assurance that the customer is truly who they present themselves to be. And so as we think about that and the growth of MDL, there may be ways that even during the interim that we can work with the dealers about acceptance of that and having that higher level of verification. So thank you. That concludes our formal presentation, but definitely want to hear your questions. And so as Nikki explained earlier, there is a question and answer functionality that you can type questions into. We just ask that you include your name and company with your question, and look forward to hearing what you might have to say.
There's one question.
We have one question. Publish it. Okay.
Switch on to publish.
Okay, so the question is, what if the buyer doesn't have a computer or is not computer literate? So good question. So initially, this will be an option, just very similar to our mobile driver's license. There are some customers who would choose to do the transaction in an electronic way, and there's some customers who will not be comfortable with that approach. So not something that will be mandated for the customers to do if they don't have a computer or don't feel comfortable doing the e-title transaction.
Two new ones.
All right, question about, do you have any plans for fleet companies? So yes, I envision that fleet companies will be able to work in a similar way where we'd have a process, likely through the portal, to be able to do e-titling transactions. And that's something that we'll probably need to flesh out with the community in terms of what that looks like. As you saw from that spoke diagram, there's many different components. I don't think I mentioned fleet specifically, but that's a good one to put on the radar, that it'll be a different dynamic, but there's no reason that we can't utilize a similar process tailored to fleets. When accepting the transfer, was there a reason why the seller's name was not provided with the vehicle information?
Sure. So right now, this is a proof of concept, and that we are having discussions about how to comply with the federal odometer disclosure statement. And so some of those, the version that goes into production might look different as we work through some of those issues, but that is one discussion point we have about how to comply with that federal odometer disclosure statement electronically, and what information do we have to share with the other state, and what information do we have to display to the buyer and the seller.
The next question.
So a question about, can this be done at a tag and title agency? So I guess the question is related to when we go live with the intrastate. Assuming that you're doing it on behalf of the customer and you have the requisite information, I don't see why the transaction, at least the one side of the transaction, could not be completed at a tag and title agency on their behalf.
How will this affect the dealers using a different ERT vendor like CVR or DealerTrack?
So good question. That's, we had showed ERT as part of the component of e-titling. So, we see the ERT vendors as a partner in this effort that will be participating once we develop the specs for what that looks like from a dealership perspective. We're obviously not there yet. Part of it will be based on what the proof of concept looks like at the national level, because we do want to be able to deploy this consistently as other states do. But yes, we believe that is a partnership that we'll continue to have with our ERT vendors. The lien is electronically released and we do not have the actual title. Can we just process in lieu of title, or do we need to get the title from MVA first? So I assume we're talking future once this goes live, and obviously once the intrastate e-title application goes live, we'll send out a bulletin with information about how you can handle that. Can you go back to that? So I think the question was, if they don't have the physical title, but they've done the transfer of title electronically with an e-title transaction, can you still move forward? So I believe that it will be in the record that the transaction has occurred that way. We'll have to think about how we display that on ERT so that you can see it. So that's a really good point in terms of what that looks like.
And the other thing is our very narrow Happy Path doesn't have liens involved at first. So that is certainly one of our expansions of that path. And so we'll hold on to this question, so make sure that we have thought through that and provide them the instructions. But the initial transfer is just without liens.
But even if they have that transactions done without a lien, they'll probably need it for the initial rollout too. Good question. That's why we're engaging you all now. If the transfer is accepted but the title has never been transferred, is there a way to undo it? Well, certainly Nikki showed that every step of the way the customer has to agree to the transfer, so certainly they are allowed to indicate that they don't want to move forward with that transaction at any point. It actually probably gives the customer, and this is another benefit, more control over the process than they even have today, because of course once you put that paper document, you've given authorization. So will you be printing titles for customers anymore, or just all online? Again, I think that this will evolve over time and will not happen all at once. So titles are not going away all at once, but obviously you all know that we stopped printing titles at the time of lien release recently, and we still provide that free title to the customer when they're ready to take action with it or request it from us. Likewise, I don't think the paper will go away all at once. I think there are steps along the way, but for now, we'll probably be in this world where we have mixed, some paper, some not paper, which is why we have to figure out how everybody feels comfortable taking action if the title has been electronically transferred as the prior transaction.
Fleet question.
Fleets will need to be able to process 10 to 20 or more units at the same time.
Okay.
We'll certainly take note of that. Are branded vehicle dealers going to be able to participate in this? We're blocked from doing some ERT functions now. We can certainly follow up. I see there's a name there. We can see what functions you're blocked from doing now and see what we would do going forward.
The dealer, can we still request for duplicate paper title after this is implemented?
So after we get to an implementation plan, we'll certainly put out a bulletin to let you know what is allowed at that point. I don't think we'd be disallowing it, but I'd also want to better understand why you need the paper title at that point. If the record is electronic, that will be the authoritative source and shouldn't really be a need for a paper title. And that's, again, why we're kind of having this conversation, because we want to plant the seed that that paper title, which, again, I know is the center of the universe today when we think about titling transactions, will not be as necessary going forward. But I know a lot of processes are built on that, and so just thinking about that as partners and what that looks like for your own business going forward.
The next question, will inquiries from systems such as CVR state if the title is electronic or not? Will customer be transferring ownership on their MVA to dealerships?
So the first part is just customer to customer, so they will not be transferring to dealerships initially, but yes, there is potential that they could do that going forward as part of that trade-in of the vehicle, and that'll be a future build-out of the process.
The next question asks, once the seller releases the vehicle to the seller, will the new buyer's information populate when we do a vehicle inquiry immediately?
So once all parties have agreed to the purchase, then our system will be updated real time. So yes, you would be able to see the new owner's information at that point under that vehicle.
Once the buyer accepts the transfer, how long do they have to complete the title transfer process?
So right now the time frame is slightly different between intrastate and interstate. I'm going to look at the team to help remember. One is 72 hours.
7 days.
7 days. So we'll put that in the information we put out. It is different between intrastate and interstate. We are aware of that difference and are going to keep that in mind as we move forward. But it is a short window of time. We want to make sure that there's adequate time to complete the transaction, but not an open-ended amount of time.
How does a dealership obtain a title if the vehicle is traded in? The dealership would be located out of state, customer lives in Maryland. The dealership is out of state.
Yeah, so I think that's a future conversation for the proof of concept that the National Association is working on. As we mentioned, right now, the initial rollout is really just the person-to-person sale in Maryland for a Maryland resident to a Maryland resident. There are a lot of complexities in terms of out-of-state transactions that we have yet to have that conversation, and I think we'll make sure that we align with our association so that we're consistent from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
We need a way to request multiple titles for fleet account after lien has been released.
Sounds like a current day scenario,
Yeah,
so
so
we'll
we'll-
refer that to our business licensing staff to respond. And I know there was another one that a customer had put in about their portal, so we'll respond to you directly.
Right. As a dealer in Maryland, do I still need to get reassignment from other dealer for out of state?
And that's what AMBA is next step gonna develop a best practice on, what that looks like from a dealer reassignment standpoint. So whether it's in state or out of state, I think there'll be some recommendations coming out about how that should be handled.
And I think there's one more. How does a dealership obtain a title if the vehicle is traded in? I think we had that one already, yeah. All car leasing sells lots of cars at Manheim, Baltimore. How will we process titles for them?
So certainly recognize that auction is an important partner. We showed that on the diagram up there. Again, we haven't had a conversation about what that piece of the transaction looks like yet, but we certainly recognize it's an important component, and it will be.
Will the 5 days actually be 5 days or actually 5 business days?
I think it's 5 calendar days.
5 calendar. If a private seller sells a vehicle to a dealer and transfer was done, does the dealer need to submit the title? Does the dealer need to title it under the dealer's name?
Yeah, that's exactly the conversation that they're having at the national level to figure out the best way for tracking the vehicle ownership when it's traded in from a customer. And so there'll be more guidance on that as we get additional guidance from our association.
Those are all the questions for now. The other questions were unrelated to e-titling, so we're going to respond to those directly.
Okay.
Those are all the questions.
Thank you for terrific questions.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of a delay between what on this town hall, so we'll just pause for a minute and see if anybody else has any other questions as they come in. But in the meantime, so I apologize I thought I'd started the recording right at the beginning. I didn't, so my apologies. We are going to do this again on May 15th. It's going to be the same presentation. We will record that one as well. So there's no need to do both unless you want to listen to it again, which we'd love to have you. But it is the same presentation, and we will also record and share that one as well.
And I just want to reemphasize that this really is about the direction we're going in the future from an e-titling perspective, and trying to start that conversation with the community now to get you thinking about how that might impact your business, operational changes that you might need to make. And so nothing at this point is being deployed in the system, so no changes are being made right now. This is really more to engage you early on in the process so that we're having the conversation, we're getting the great questions that you've already submitted. Also recognize that you'll probably think about this and contemplate this over the next few days. You can always still submit questions to us. I'm happy to answer those questions over time. We want to make sure we recognize this is a very large change for the industry. Again, it will not happen overnight, but we want to make sure that you are involved in the process and able to ask as many questions.
So a couple of questions just came in. Someone's asking, like the VA DMV, are we able to flip the title to the dealer's name without paying taxes?
So we don't have a process like that today. However, we are aware of the Virginia process. As I said, we are talking to the National Association about a standardized process that all states could use for that dealer assignment process, and we'll be sure to put out a dealer bulletin once we have additional information there.
Okay, that's almost the same question. Will dealers have to pay taxes and title fee if they need to title vehicles under dealer's name? There's one other question, but Shaniqua's going to answer. It's a wholesale dealer question. We're going to start.
Great.
Okay, I think those were.
Did you see the one about safety measures?
Are there other safety measures in place other than a person's My MVA login? What other measures will prevent theft?
Question. So yeah, it's not just for my MVA login, to be clear, that's why we mentioned that mobile driver's license and that verified credential. Verified credential, there's complex definition of what that looks like, but essentially it means it's tied to an in-person transaction, so it's not just the remote provisioning of your mobile driver's license, but actually when you come into the MVA, tying your identity to that MDL, so we have that higher level of assurance of your identity, so it is not just a MyMVA login, it requires that additional higher level verification. And that's why I mentioned at the end that, you know, encouraging individuals to have have an MDL is really an important component of this process, because making sure it's the right person is critical. We obviously don't want to allow vehicle sale to happen if it is not the true individual they're presenting themselves to be.
One last question. What will a dealership have a customer sign in terms of a title if they have an e-title?
Those are things that we'll provide additional guidance on as we get further along in the process. You can see from the transaction customer to customer, there's a lot of you know, indicating agreement with something electronic, which counts as an electronic signature. I know that dealers use electronic signatures for many things even today. And so it will likely be similar to what you saw with the private sale, but different based on the dealership dynamic.
Can we get a MyMVA account today for a company that owns 2,000 vehicles?
Yes, so businesses can get my MBA accounts. We can follow up and see how we can facilitate that.
Yeah.
I think that's all questions.
Great. Well, again, thank you for taking your time to join us today. We really appreciate all the great questions and all the feedback. I saw we have well over 100 attendees, so we're really excited about that, and look forward to continuing the dialogue, and hopefully you take it in that vein that we're really here providing information with the goal of making things more efficient, more secure, and working with you together to make that happen. So thank you for joining us and for taking the time. I don't know if there's anything further we'd like to add. If not, everybody have a wonderful day and stay safe. Thank you.